In June of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands began. The successive precision and area bombing would be essential to make the Japanese surrender. However, Japan had one last trump card to destroy the large B-29 formations that rained death over the country. The Kyushu J7W1 Shinden fighter interceptor, aptly named Magnificent Lightning, as it would strike down on the Allied strategic bomber formations with its 4 Type 5 30mm cannons and shred the B-29s to pieces. At least, that was the whole premise of one of the most unique and advanced Japanese aircraft of the Second World War that did not arrive in time to either enter operation or much less change the tide of the war, as some documentaries would say. To those unfamiliar with the Know Your Plane series, I do like to feature a unique aircraft to shed light on their history. So in this episode, let's talk about the history and specifications of the Shinden, the only canard aircraft of World War II that was ordered into production. The development of the Shinden dates back to Japan's defensive strategy in 1943. At that time, an invasion of Japan was unthinkable, as the Japanese still controlled the Philippines, the East Indies, and the islands on the Asian side of the Pacific. However, the military command was aware and expected Allied bombings against the 4 Japanese main islands, namely Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. By far, Honshu was the most important of them all, as it encompassed the largest Japanese cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. These cities were also home for the large aircraft companies of Japan like Mitsubishi and Nakajima, and their respective manufacturing and assembly plants. Meanwhile, the island of Kyushu only had one minor aircraft manufacturer, and that's where the development of the Shinden took place. The Japanese military leaders expected the Allies to attack from 2 different ways, either by small bombers launched from American aircraft carriers close to the Japanese coast, like the WWII, or by large strategic bombers based in China. In the first scenario, the Japanese could use its network of patrol boats to identify the threat and have its ships or aircraft intercept the American task force with enough time. However, things were more difficult in the Chinese front. The Allies could set up airfields very deep behind the front lines and use long-range strategic bombers to attack the home islands. Adding to that, there were intelligence reports of a new American bomber with a very long range and high operational altitude that was to be put into production. That was the B-29, and the Japanese estimated to face it by the fall of 1943. So the Japanese leadership knew they would eventually have enemy bombers overhead, so they began to prepare in advance. The Japanese Navy then stated out its requirements to replace the obsolete aircraft tasked with defending the home islands. A superior high-speed land-based fighter capable of mastering the shooting down of enemy bombers, an altitude of more than 8,700 meters at 400 knots, to be able to reach 8,000 meters in under 10 minutes 30 seconds, a maximum altitude of more than 12,000 meters. Equipped with 4 Type 17 30mm machine guns. And by the way, they say machine guns because the Japanese Navy considered anything below 40mm to be a machine gun at that time. These requirements were handed off to Masaoki Tsurunu, a designer of the Dai-ichi Kaigun Koku Gijitsusho, or the first naval air technical arsenal from Yokosuka. Tsurunu had been researching the aerodynamics of a canard design, which was very unusual at the time since 1940, and he thought it was the best way to minimize the fuselage of the aircraft while increasing speed. To prove the feasibility of such design, the Naval Air Technical Arsenal designed the MX-Y6 glider in the shape of the Shinden. 3 prototypes made of wood were built by the Chigasaki Seizo company and tested in January of 1944. One of them was even equipped with a 22 horsepower semi-11 4-cylinder air-cooled engine. Given that the trials of a radical new design occurred without problems and the concept was deemed feasible, the Japanese Navy gave the green light for the J7W1 project. Since the Shinden was developed and ordered by the Japanese Navy and not the Army, as Japan did not have an independent air force at that time, the name conforms to the Navy's short designation system. The J stands for land-based aircraft, the 7 because the Shinden was a 7th aircraft in the J category. The W stands for its manufacturer, Watanabe, which was later renamed Kyushu Aircraft Company, but they kept the W, and the 1 refers to the first variant of the aircraft. There were also plans for the J7W2, which would be equipped with a jet engine, but we'll talk about that later in the video. Meanwhile, the nickname Shinden also comes from a standard Japanese system where fighters were named after meteorological phenomena and where all interceptors would have a name that ends with Den, which means lightning. In the end, they chose Shinden, which means magnificent lightning. Although the initial research with the glider prototypes was done by the Navy's Yokosuka Technical Arsenal, it is important to point out that they are not a manufacturer, so they had to approach a certain established manufacturer to further finish development and start serial production from the design that they made. The manufacturer chosen by the Navy was the Kyushu Aircraft Company. I'm sure you heard about Mitsubishi and Nakajima, but it wouldn't surprise me if this is the first time you hear about Kyushu, because it was one of the minor manufacturers throughout the war. In the year of 1943, Kyushu produced only 12% of all naval trainers and only 3% of all combat aircraft in Japan. The reason for choosing Kyushu to finish the development was actually quite simple. All the major manufacturers like Kawanishi, Mitsubishi, and Nakajima were already busy with the production and development of other aircraft, such as the Jinpu, the Senden, and the Tenrai. So they did not have the resources to accommodate another project, but Kyushu could. As an added benefit, all of Kyushu's plants were located around the city of Fukuoka, in the island of Kyushu, with the Zasshonokuma plant being the most important one and where assembly of all its aircraft took place. These plants were so small, relatively speaking, that they were never targeted or damaged by an American bombing raid during the entire war. Now, surely Kyushu did not have the technical experience to handle a modern and complex project like the Shinden, so the staff from the technical arsenal was dispatched to aid in the development and manufacturing of the plane. Work on the Shinden began in June of 1944, the same month as the first B-29 raid against the home islands. But the Navy was in a hurry and wanted a prototype ready by January of 1945 in order to commence flight testing. In order to speed up development, the construction of the prototype began from parts that had already been confirmed, although the design was not yet completely finished. In September of 1944, a mock-up was completed for an exterior inspection by the staff of the technical arsenal. That inspection was deemed successful and the Shinden was praised for its good visibility from the cockpit. It was after this that things started to slow down. The frequency and intensity of Allied bombing raids increased, and by the end of 1944, Kyushu as a whole suffered several setbacks. First, the Japanese Army and Navy's conscription started to take away skilled labor from Kyushu because the military did not consider the current occupation of prospective soldiers. As a result of that, half of the skilled labor of Kyushu, approximately 4,500 people, were sent to the military, and Kyushu had to make do with new, unskilled workers. In December of 1944, the government also had two contradictory policies. They obviously wanted to increase the output of aircraft manufacture, and at the same time, they issued a mandatory dispersal program where aircraft manufacturers were ordered to move their facilities to bunkers, caves, or anywhere necessary in order to avoid Allied bombing, as Japan's aviation industry was their main target. Needless to say, Kyushu's monthly aircraft production plummeted from 133 units in November 1944 to only 33 aircraft in April of 1945. And besides moving all equipment and tooling to caves outside of the city, let's remember the desperate situation of getting new raw materials for the aviation industry as a whole. Speaking of raw materials, the Shinden was an all-metal aircraft, and since it was on the high priority list of projects, it did get better access to materials via the Ministry of Ammunitions. With the exception of the engine and electronic components, all other parts like wings, gear, and fuselage were made in the Kyushu island in close proximity to Kyushu's main assembly plant, so the project schedule was not affected so much by Allied bombing. Meanwhile, Mitsubishi, who was responsible for the production of the Shinden's engine in Nagoya, was only able to deliver the Mk9D engine to Kyushu in April of 1945 due to Allied bombing. Trials on the Mitsubishi engine began in May, and the first prototype was officially finished by June 10th of 1945. At completion, the first prototype was 100 kilograms heavier than expected, and it was not equipped with weapons. It was in this state that it was disassembled and sent to flight testing at Mushiroda Airfield. the modern-day Fukuoka Airport, also known as the Fuk Airport. By June of 1945, the Japanese Navy was so desperate that it had already ordered the Shinden into mass production even before the first flight of the aircraft. The estimated monthly production was extremely optimistic considering the short availability of raw materials and skilled workers at 30 aircraft per month in the Zasshonokuma plant and 120 aircraft in Nakajima's Honda plant. By the year of 1947, the Navy expected to have over 1,000 Shindens manufactured and operational. The first attempt of a flight test happened in late July with Tsuruno, the main designer of the Shinden, at the controls. During takeoff, the propeller tips hit the ground as the aircraft pitched up and the takeoff was aborted. To prevent this accident from happening again, Kyushu got the wheels of another aircraft they manufactured and placed them at the bottom of the wings. The propeller of prototype number 1 was replaced with the propeller of the second prototype for the continuation of flight testing. The first actual flight happened on August 3rd of 1945 with Kyushu test pilot Miyashi in the cockpit. As the plane pitched up, it yawed to the right thanks to the torque of the engine, and this strong yaw continued on both cruise and landing. The second flight test happened on August the 6th, the same day as the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Even after hearing about the mysterious and tragic weapon unleashed against their own country, the development team did not feel demotivated and continued to work on the Shinden intensely. The third test flight and the final flight of the Shinden took place on August the 8th, one day before the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, and a full-speed flight test was scheduled for August the 17th, although that test never took place. In total, 3 Shinden prototypes were being built, with the first one flying for approximately 45 minutes in total, where the landing gear was always extended and it never carried weapons. The only notable problem during flight testing was the strong pull to the right, which was being corrected by adjusting the attachment angle of wings and flap. The war was officially over on August the 15th, but on the following day, Tsuruno gave the order to burn all documentation of the aircraft so as not to contribute to Allied technological advancement. The second prototype was almost ready, just waiting for the engine delivery and its mounting. The third prototype was a work in progress. These aircraft were supposed to be dismantled, loaded on a truck, placed into a pit and then doused with gasoline after being buried. But in October of 1945, the Americans did find the first prototype, or the remains of it, and the craft was disassembled and shipped to the United States, where it can still be found at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. With the history of the craft out of the way, let's talk about the Shinden's design, performance, and armaments, starting from the rear to the front of the aircraft. The Shinden's engine was the Mitsubishi Mk9D, part of the A20 engine family that packed 18 cylinders, a supercharger, and methanol injection. The engine was based on the Kinsei design that was originally meant for the Mitsubishi J7W1 Shinden, an experimental twin-boom interceptor that eventually got cancelled. It was rated at 2,030 horsepower at takeoff, capable of running at 2,900 RPMs, and 1,160 horsepower at 28,000 feet at 2,800 RPM. In the Shinden, the Mk9D was mounted just behind the cockpit and drove a Sumitomo VDM 6-blade constant speed propeller behind the craft, which required a 750mm extension to its shaft. In total, the Shinden had 4 problems related to the engine and its configuration. First was shaft vibration when under load due to the long shaft extension. Second, excessive torque, especially during takeoff. Third, insufficient engine cooling on the ground because there's barely any cooling air coming into the air intakes, and the cooling fan was installed just in front of the propeller, which is far from the engine. And the fourth problem was a low clearance between the 3.4 meter diameter propeller and the ground. As I recall, the propeller did get damaged from hitting the ground on the Shinden's first attempted test flight. To prevent the accident from happening again, the designers added one wheel at the bottom of each wing to make them the lowest point of the aircraft during pitch up. These 2 wheels were taken from another aircraft manufactured by Kyushu, the K-11W1 Shiragiku bomber trainer. The Shinden's remarkable wings were angled at 20 degrees and had both slats and 2 tiered flaps on the trailing edge. The elevators had a deflection range of 25 degrees up or 30 degrees down. Each wing was fitted with an internal 200-liter fuel tank and a 75-liter methanol tank, and the main fuel tank of 400 liters was located in the fuselage. To further increase range, the Shinden could also carry a drop tank of 200 liters under each wing. The Shinden could also carry a total of 2 60-kilogram bombs or 4 30-kilogram bombs on the hard points located under the wings. Both wings and fuselage were designed to withstand 7 Gs. The Shinden's canards located on the nose of the craft were remarkably thin, with 5mm panel used for the spars throughout the upper side, and the canards also featured flaps that were moved by the same hydraulic actuators as the one from the main wings. In regards to offensive armament, the Shinden was to be originally fitted with 4 30mm cannons, or machine guns as they were called at the time by the Navy. The first choice was a Type 17 cannon, but it was later changed to the Type 5. Each gun weighed 70 kilograms and could fire 350 grams of ammo at 750 meters per second. As you can expect from such heavy armament aimed at destroying American strategic bombers, the recoil was strong, so special reinforcing was necessary. The pilot could also choose to either fire all guns at once or only the 2 lower ones. To prevent damage to the propeller from ejecting shells from the cannon, all shells would be kept in internal storage compartments located in the nose of the Shinden and would only be removed on the ground by the maintenance crew. Speaking of maintenance, the Shinden was designed with removable panels to improve aircraft serviceability. While in some aircraft a few items could only be adjusted from inside the cockpit, the maintenance crew of the Shinden could just remove the panels and fix the components from the outside. Another remarkable feature of the Shinden was the tricycle gear configuration, which was very unique for aircraft in the Japanese Navy at the time. The front gear was retracted by a single actuator, and apparently from the records remaining, it did not have steering from the pilot, so it would need a tow bar when the plane was on the ground. If there was ever a problem with hydraulic system, the pilot could still lower and lock the gear by opening a compartment in the cockpit and letting the aircraft wait and wind do the work. It is said that the front gear of the Shinden was the same as the one from the R2Y1 Kyushu reconnaissance aircraft, which is said to be inspired or copied by the gear of a captured Douglas A-28 twin-engine bomber. Meanwhile, the main gears and the wheel covers came from the Nakajima's C6 and Sayun. I cannot emphasize enough that both front and rear gears were massive, both exceeding 1 meter and 80 centimeters to provide enough clearance to the propeller. All in all, the Shinden was a very tall aircraft at 3 meters and 92 centimeters. It had a wingspan of 11 meters and 11 centimeters and a length of 9 meters and 66 centimeters. Its weight ranged from 3,645 kilos empty to 4,928 kilos when loaded to 5,228 kilograms as its maximum takeoff weight. With the Mk9D engine, the Shinden was to reach a top speed of 405 at its operational altitude of 8,700 meters and a cruising speed of 228 knots at 4,000 meters. As for climb, it would go from sea level to 8,000 meters in 10 minutes and 40 seconds. Its surface ceiling was 12,000 meters. Without drop tanks, the Shinden could carry up to 800 liters of regular fuel, 100 liters of methanol, and 165 liters of oil. Its range without drop tanks was of 460 nautical miles. The Shinden had an endurance between 30 minutes in combat power up to 2 hours in a cruise setting. Its takeoff and landing distances were of 560 and 580 meters. Based on the data given, the Shinden could create havoc among the B-29 bomber formations that bombed Japan with its powerful 4 30mm cannons in the early to mid phases of the Allied bombing campaign as they were unescorted. But of course, the aircraft's development and production was just too late. Interestingly, the designers of the Shinden did consider pilot survivability, which let's say was not a priority for the Japanese and their kamikaze stunts. First, there was a 16mm bulletproof panel in front of the cannons to protect the pilot from frontal attacks. There was also a 17mm bulletproof glass in front of the pilot. The fuel tanks had a 22mm thick layer of rubber, idea from a downed B-29. Aft of the cockpit there was also one brace to protect the pilot from overturning. And last of all, the pilot could eject from the plane without getting shredded by the propeller. An emergency separation lever located in the cockpit would open the movable windshield and blow the propeller and deceleration gearbox with a charge of gunpowder. These are the features of the Shinden prototype, but while I'm at it, let me go over some differences that would or could be implemented in the mass production of the Shinden. First, Mass production Shindens were supposed to have 4 propeller blades instead of 6, and 4 oxygen tanks instead of the 2 found in the prototype's cockpit. In the same location, the mass production plane was to have 2 protective braces, not just 1. Additionally, the nose of the aircraft, which was empty in the prototype, could be fitted with either a gun camera or 2 7.9mm machine guns. There were also plans for another version of the Shinden called J7W1, which would be fitted with one Ishikawajima NE130 axial flow turbojet engine capable of providing 900 kilograms of thrust. But unfortunately for the Japanese, their engine technology did not make progress fast enough even with the help of the Germans. At the end of these videos, I usually like to go over some trivia about the aircraft featured on the episode. What I found on the Shinden was that the pilot could enter from both sides of the cockpit, and oddly enough, each side has 2 retractable steps which are very high on the fuselage. There are no pictures of anyone using these steps, and during all flight tests people used ladders, which were pretty much required for an airplane that was that high. Also interesting that unlike Western aircraft, in the Shinden the pilot would open fire by pulling the trigger that was located in the throttle lever, not in the stick. Lastly, Watanabe Ironworks, which was the parent company of Kyushu, still exists today, and in their website you can still see a section dedicated to the Shinden. Unfortunately, all the text there is in Japanese, and getting information on the Shinden in English to make this video was a pain, so I would really appreciate if you subscribe, like, and share this video with your friends to support the channel, because episodes like this take a long time to make. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think of the Shinden in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.